Good morning to the DME for Peace community, and welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. The M&E Thursday Talks on DME for Peace are made possible with the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York through the Peace Building Evaluation Consortium. My name is Jack Farrell, and I am the DME for Peace Project Manager at Search for Common Ground. And today, in a change of scenery, I'm hosting this week's edition of the Thursday Talks from a damp but lovely London ahead of next week's Merle Tech Conference. Just a note on the Merle Tech Conference, I know many of you online today will be attending, so please feel free to get in touch. I'd love to chat with you all about your experiences with DME for Peace, the platform itself, as well as how we can do better knowledge sharing in this field. Now to the important part, and today I'm delighted to welcome Matthew Nanes, who will lead a discussion on surveys and countering violent extremism, a practitioner guide. As a reminder, once Matthew has finished his presentation, we'll jump right into a question and answer session. You can ask your questions in advance of the discussion portion by submitting them through the question function on GoToWebinar throughout the presentation. I will now hand over to Matthew. Matthew, you're very welcome to the Thursday Talks. The floor is all yours.
Great, thanks very much. So today I'm presenting a guide produced by the Asia Foundation on how to use surveys when conducting research or programming on countering violent extremism. The guide was produced in conjunction with the Australia Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade as part of a larger partnership for developing knowledge on how to counter violent extremism in Asia. And so as part of this partnership, TAF and DFAT convened a workshop of governments, donors, civil society, and researchers across Asia in October 2016. And so this guide is one of the products of the partnership, and it's intended to help practitioners who are conducting CVE programming that might benefit from using surveys. And so it's not a how-to guide for running a survey, but really it's intended to address some of the unique challenges that you're likely to encounter when using surveys specifically about CVE, and we try to provide some suggestions for how to deal with those challenges. So let's jump right in. First of all, why do we need this guide? It came out of a recognition that surveys provide really valuable information about attitudes, experiences, and outcomes, but their effectiveness depends heavily on proper implementation. And the problem is that conditions that warrant CVE programming in the first place make survey implementation really hard, right? So when you're talking about CVE, you're usually interested in sensitive topics, skeptical respondents, and violent conditions. And so the guide provides technical assistance for aid agencies that want to run surveys under these types of difficult conditions. Now, up front, I should say that we don't advocate for surveys as the best tool or the only tool, and we recommend that you combine surveys with other types of information collection in order to really see the whole picture. So you might also do qualitative interviews and focus groups or analyze administrative data, but surveys do have certain strengths that can't be ignored. They're very good for surveying across multiple populations of interest or running the same survey longitudinally to track changes over time. They are very good for evaluating relationships between drivers and outcomes at the individual level. So for example, questions like, how does church attendance affect loyalty to insurgent groups? Questions where you're interested in individual level drivers and outcomes. And finally, surveys generate really good data for multivariate analysis, which allows you to test the impact of one specific driver on an outcome holding all other possible drivers or confounds constant at the same time. Now, surveys, of course, do have certain weaknesses. They're not so good for developing a theory of change. They're excellent for testing it, but not so much for developing it. And similarly, they're not great for identifying mechanisms. And so we don't suggest that surveys are a panacea. As far as what you would use a survey for in CVE programming, you might consider integrating surveys into the design of your program from the very beginning. And if you do this, you can use surveys to identify recipients for your program, track progress and uptake throughout the program, and then evaluate impact after the fact. So you can go back to your your donors, your funders, and say, this is the exact impact that we had. Or as you evaluate the program before maybe moving on to the next stage, you can look at exactly what worked and what didn't to refine the program for the next stage. You might also use a survey to accurately measure the attitudes and experiences of an entire population, rather than just limiting your measurements and your information to the most vocal individuals. Right? When we do interviews and focus groups, we often get really detailed information, but only out of certain people. And so surveys are a really good way to get something a little bit more systematic and a little bit broader. And finally, they're great, as I already said, for identifying broad trends and making comparisons either across populations or tracking changes over time. So I'll spend the rest of the time that we have today giving you a few examples of the types of problems and solutions that we deal with in the guide. This is certainly not everything that's in there, and so I do recommend you maybe download the guide from the Asia Foundation's website and take a look at all of the other items that are there. But just to give you sort of an example of the sorts of things that the guide talks about. So one of the first problems that you might encounter is that the population you're interested in is difficult to access due to safety concerns, right? Particularly with CVE, you might be interested in populations living in conflict areas or areas under a repressive government regime, and it may not be safe for you to send your enumerators, your surveyors into the area. So there are a couple of things you can do. You can use phone or internet-based surveys. So you don't rely on sending people to knock on doors. Of course, this depends on technology and depends on having a way to contact people. Or you can survey in an alternate location with what we call intercept interviews. And a great example of an intercept interview comes from the Asia Foundation's survey in Afghanistan. As you can imagine, there are certain parts of Afghanistan that they were really interested in, but weren't safe to send enumerators. And so instead, the survey team set up at highway junctions and bus stations where they knew people would be traveling through from other areas, and they intercepted people from the places they were interested in and surveyed them there. You can also use sort of a hybrid between these two methods. Something that I did in my own research in the Philippines, I was interested in interviewing people who lived in rural areas with a large NPA presence. And I didn't feel comfortable sending enumerators to go to those areas. But I had a list of the people I wanted to survey and their phone numbers. And so we were able to call them and ask them to come to the barangay hall, the village hall, at a specific time and take the survey there. The next problem you might run into is that the topics on the survey are dangerous or illegal to talk about, or they might risk angering armed groups. And common sense would suggest you avoid observers under these situations. You don't want anyone standing around listening to the questions that you're asking or the answers that you're receiving. You should do the best you can to ensure respondent anonymity. That means surveying in a private location, but also not recording their names, or if you absolutely have to record their names, keep that information separate from where you keep the answers that they give, so that if the data is breached, it's impossible for someone to link what was said to who said it. You can use tablets to secure the data. Most of the survey software available that I'm familiar with allows you to lock the surveys once they're completed. So as soon as that enumerator hits finish, it's no longer possible to view any of the answers on the tablet. You can only view the answers by uploading them to a secure computer. And so if the enumerator gets stopped coming out of someone's house by a police officer, or maybe by a combatant, or even just a curious government official, they can safely hand over the tablet without any risk of people being able to view the responses. You should avoid direct individual level questions on sensitive topics. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I do want to note that you should ensure that respondents understand their legal rights to privacy. There are a lot of situations in which a police officer or a court or a government official can legally compel you to turn over your data. And so if that's something that can plausibly happen, you can't promise your respondents that you'll never turn over the data because you may not be able to keep that promise. So it's important to make sure that your respondents and your participants have an accurate understanding of what their rights are so that they can make an informed decision about whether or not to participate. Because surveys on CVE cover sensitive topics, they suffer from unusually high rates of either refusal to answer a question or refusal to participate in the survey in the first place. Now, this is especially problematic because non-response prevents generalizability. It prevents you from using your survey of certain individuals in the population to describe the population more generally. And the problem is that the people who refuse to answer the survey are different from the people who agree to answer the survey. And so this skews your results. There are a few ways that we can solve non-response, or at least begin to mitigate it. And they depend on the reason for the non-response in the first place. And there are two basic reasons you might run into. The first is people just don't want to reveal information. And unfortunately, it's really difficult to solve this. And under these circumstances, surveys just may not be the right tool. But luckily, this is actually less common. And what's more common is that people are willing to provide the information, but they don't want their identity linked with the answers that they give you. And we do know how to do things to mitigate the second problem. And so the first thing I would suggest is either moderating or softening your questions or depersonalizing the questions. So I'll give you some examples. Let's say the original item that you were interested in is, do you believe that heretics should be killed? This is sensitive and it's also personal. It asks about their personal belief. And people may not tell the truth or they may not be willing to answer. So a moderated version might be, do you believe that it's ever justified to use violence against those who insult God? And a depersonalized version would be, would you say that people in your village generally think that heretics should be killed, right? So it makes it a little bit easier for them to give you an accurate answer without it being quite so sensitive. Now, sometimes careful wording isn't enough, and respondents still don't want to link their identity with the answer. And there are a few other things you can try. Some simple solutions are you can turn to self-enumeration. So instead of asking the respondent to say their answer out loud to the surveyor, they can just hand them the clipboard or hand them the tablet and let them enter it themselves. Of course, this requires a literate population. You can try to use trusted enumerators, either people who come from the community that you're surveying or people who are associated with an organization that the respondents are familiar with and trust, maybe a local NGO or a university. And as I mentioned before, you should always avoid onlookers. People do answer differently when there are others listening in, of course. You should never force respondents to answer if they're uncomfortable. First of all, because it's unethical, but also because it could mess up your data. People are unlikely to tell the truth when they're being pressured into an answer. And you would rather just have them say, I don't want to tell you that, than have them give you an answer that's not true. Now, finally, if none of those methods work, you can use a more advanced solution, which we call randomization techniques. These are measurement devices that allow respondents to hide their answer to a sensitive question so that nobody, not the enumerator, not the analyst later on, can ever determine how they answered. But the analyst can use probability theory to estimate sample level responses. So for example, if we wanted to know about participation in a riot, using a randomization technique, we could tell what proportion of respondents participated in the riot, but not whether any individual respondent participated. And the reason this helps is that if respondents understand that the question protects their answer and their anonymity, they should be more willing to answer truthfully. And so in the guide, we give a number of examples of these different types of randomization techniques and how they work. The final item that I want to discuss is working with survey firms. because it's often inefficient to maintain in-house technical expertise on a full-time basis unless you're running surveys constantly. But the problem, of course, is it's not plausible to run a useful, high-quality survey without that trained expertise. And so you may find yourself wanting to contract with outside firms to do the more complicated parts of the survey, like designing the sampling strategy, figuring out exactly who you'll talk to, implementing the survey, and analyzing the results. And you need to account for these costs from the very beginning of the project. When you're budgeting, you definitely want to get multiple bids because the costs from these outside firms will vary wildly, particularly in difficult to reach populations. And it's really helpful to have these numbers up front before you start budgeting. And finally, you should look for firms with local expertise as well as experience working with sensitive topics. So market research firms may have the technical expertise to run a very good, high quality survey, but they're often not equipped to deal with the sensitive topics when it comes to CVE. And so you may be better off either working with an NGO that deals with conflict and sensitive issues, or an academic researcher as well. So that's what I have for you today. You can see on your screen the URL if you want to download the guide. If by some chance you don't get to ask your question today, please feel free to reach out to me by email as well.
Matthew, thank you very much. You've given us a lot of food for thought and a lot of practical information. I will, during the Q&A, put a link to the guide in the chat box for everyone. And also, it's worth noting that the link to the guide is also in the emails announcing this webinar, as well as the webpage on Deeming for Peace. So we'll have it alongside the recording. As you now know, we're now going to open up the webinar for questions. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday talks. You can submit a question one of two ways. The first way you can submit a question is through the question function on GoToWebinar, and that will allow you to type your question. The second is to click on the little hand icon, which will raise your hand and allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. Just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on Deeming for Peace, so those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and discussion and learn from our wider engagement. I see the questions are already flowing in, so we're going to jump in. First question comes from Daniela Dijugan, and Daniela asks, how would you implement a survey in a conflict region where access to technology is limited?
Thanks. So that's a great question and a common problem. It often depends exactly what the technological limitations are. In some of the areas where I've worked, which for background is mainly the Philippines and Iraq, internet access is going to be one of the main limitations. And that can be frustrating because it's great, especially if you're using tablets. It's great to have them auto-uploading your data for security and to prevent loss. And unfortunately, that's not an option when mobile internet coverage is limited. You may not even have access to tablets at all, which means using pen and paper the old-fashioned way. I know in one of my surveys that I conducted in Baghdad, we wanted to do some very complicated things about randomization and changing the order of the questions and changing the types of questions. And what we ended up having to do was print out multiple versions of the survey onto paper and just shuffle them. And so when we knocked on a door, whichever version was at the top was the one that we implemented. So that was a low-tech solution. So yeah, you often have to think outside the box when it comes to technological limitations.
Great, thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Daniela, for your question. Our next question comes from Tammy Smith, and Tammy, I see you've raised your hand, so your microphone is now live.
Great, thanks very much, and thanks, Matthew. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, super. No, I just wanted to follow up on the issue of the non-responses, and just say that, I mean, appreciating very much the sort of alternative ways to try to elicit a response that you were noting. But also non-responses can be interesting data in and of themselves. And so just to, I mean, maybe the practitioner's guide also sort of goes into this, but it's sometimes extremely interesting to see who isn't responding or the ways in which they are not responding. And if there are patterns in those things, then you can begin to sort of redirect your research into understanding how different forms of formal and informal institutions are shaping that narrative or that position or those thoughts. It was just a sort of comment on appreciating the sort of silences in narrative. Thanks.
That's a fantastic point. One of the things that I noticed when I was pouring through existing surveys to prepare the guide was actually practitioners and aid agency surveys do an unusually good job of differentiating between people who refuse to answer and people who say they don't know. And that's something that, coming from the academic side, we don't do such a great job of. And so even something like that provides a good opportunity to look at why people aren't responding. And then, as you said correctly, you can take those non-responses, especially if they're non-responses to specific questions, and look at how they answered other questions and look for patterns there. And as you say, you can find a lot of interesting information in that lack of information.
Great. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Tammy, for asking a question live. Our next question comes from Tara Kraft, and Tara has asked, do you have any tips for strong TORs for contracting consultants and firms to ensure a successful outcome? Often working with local firms, there is a give and take relationship where we need their technical skills, but they could also use our support to improve their professionalism, reporting skills, and also just to build their general capacity.
That is a good question. I will admit, coming from the academic side, it's not something that I'm as familiar with. Yeah, to be honest, I would be, the format doesn't really allow for it, but I would be interested to know what some of you all with a little bit more experience on that side would think about it. So I'm sorry, I don't have a great answer to that.
No problem. And I think we make a call to the sort of 90 people online right now. If you have any experience in drafting TORs in this area, please feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute your microphone. Our next question actually is a raised hand, which comes from Serge Eric Yaku Dijam. And Serge, I hope you meant to raise your hand because your microphone is now live.
Okay. Thanks so much, Jack. Good morning, Matthew, and thanks for these wonderful presentations. Actually, I'm a credential evaluator working as a freelance expert, mostly in Africa and in North America. So actually, we are working with WFP, the World Food Programs, in evaluating the country portfolio of WFP in Rome and in Cameroon around the Central African refugee in Central Africa, the Boko Haram issue in the north. And then, but my question is about, a past experience I did with Creative Associate International. It was not easy for us to make a survey around a country violence extremist, especially within a program started by USAID, mostly to strengthen civil society and local government institutions in the north of Cameroon. In Nigeria, for instance, we find a lot of non-response into the survey. Same issue in Nigeria and in Cameroon. So I wonder how with these guides you could be able to get a valid data, or let's say digestible information to consider as credible data for drafting a report and draw some conclusions. Because for our case in 2016, 2 years ago, we're not able to go to this end, and then we just generate some key learning from the different objectives of the evaluations in these 3 countries. So with this guide, I wonder how, in this type of context, or when do you think we can apply this guide? Is it during the intensive side of the violence, like you mentioned the case of Afghanistan, or if you take the case of Boko Haram's, or is it between in the middle terms or after? Because beneficiary local population They are very scared due to the insecurity happening in the host area. So maybe that was one reason why we get a lot of non-response. So how do you think we can fix this kind of guide into this kind of this environment? Thanks so much.
Yeah, that does sound like a really tough context to run a survey, particularly because I suspect there are a number of different factors in that situation that are preventing people from wanting to respond. You know, the best advice I can give in such a general context is to understand why it is that people are not responding. And that may actually be a good situation for focus groups or qualitative interviews, especially something a little bit less formal, where you can go to some of your potential interviewees before you start running the survey and field test your questions and say, you know, would you feel comfortable answering this question? And more importantly, if they say no, ask them why. And then you can maybe get a better sense of what's stopping people from wanting to answer before you invest heavily in actually running the survey. And you can either refine the questions to make them more palatable to people, or maybe rethink whether a survey is the right tool under those circumstances. But piloting and field testing can definitely be helpful.
Great, thank you, Serge, and thank you, Matthew, for your answer. The next question comes from Laura Gagliardone, who says, "Thank you for educating us on the art of asking questions. Is there a difference between addressing questions to find out, assess the situation, and to monitor and evaluate what has been implemented?"
Yeah, definitely. Retrospective questions, there's a whole extra set of concerns when you're asking people to recall what's already happened. Not only about whether they're willing to answer and whether they're willing to tell the truth, but whether they remember accurately. And so when you're writing retrospective questions, you have to, first of all, be careful to only ask questions that people will reasonably have an accurate answer to. It's difficult to ask what they had for lunch on Wednesday 10 years ago. Even if they answer, they're probably not going to be giving accurate information. But you also want to make sure you're not prompting their answer or skewing their memory, so to speak, with the way that you ask. So retrospective questions, which of course we like because they're a great way for evaluating programs after the fact, but we do have to be especially careful about the way that we ask them.
Great. Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you, Laura, for your question. Just a reminder to those of you online, you can ask your questions through the question function on GoToWebinar, or you can click on the hand icon, which will allow us to unmute your microphone. The next question comes from Miriam Chikwanda, and Miriam asks, "Inviting participants to a secluded venue sounds great, but what are the chances that they actually turn up? Have you considered using incentives here?"
Right, so there you get at a couple really important points, one of which, incentives, I didn't talk about yet, so this is a great opportunity to talk about it now. As far as will they turn up without incentives, in my experience, people like to share and people like to talk and they like to be listened to. And so actually, if they trust you and it's logistically feasible, they will show up. Now, if you ask them to take a very expensive train ride that they can't afford, they're not going to come. If it's the rainy season and you ask them to walk 3 miles and the road is washed out, they're not going to come. But in my experience, if they can, they will. Now, as far as using incentives, there are a couple of different schools of thought on this, and I don't think we have a consensus on what's right and what's wrong. It's nice to pay an incentive, whether that's cash or snacks, or in the case of the Philippines, we often give out cell phone load that they can use for mobile data and for SMS. It's nice to compensate them for the time that they're giving you. And it also makes them feel a little bit better about spending their personal time to help you out. As you can imagine, people also are more willing to give you their time if you compensate them for it. But you don't want to overcompensate, because then taking surveys becomes viewed as a replacement for employment, and people will seek out the surveys, and those people are not necessarily representative of the general population. They're people who may not have another source of income. They're people who may be disproportionately interested in whatever incentive you're giving out, and so having incentives that are a little bit too strong can affect who ends up in the survey. It also affects the way that people answer. If you're paying them a lot, your respondents feel beholden to you, and they try to give you answers that they think you want to hear. And you may say, you know, there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer, we're just interested in your opinion or your experience. But people are human, and they don't always respond accordingly. And if you're giving them too strong of an incentive, they are going to try to answer in a way that pleases you, which of course harms the accuracy of the data.
Thank you, Matthew. Our next question, and I think we might be on course to set a record for most hands raised in a Thursday talk, comes from George Weiss. And George, your microphone is now live. Please feel free to ask your question.
Yeah, hi. I actually mentioned it. I wrote it down. I was just wondering if the methods enumerated here apply also to a media-savvy Western environment. If you want to, I don't know, find out about the media habits of neo-Nazis or jihadists, are there any special methods that could apply to such an extremely sensitive and possibly dangerous environment?
Yeah, so the big difference in my experience with surveying in a Western, especially a more developed Western setting, is cost. Your survey firm costs more and people's time costs more. And so certainly when we talk about compensation, Western survey respondents expect to be paid, and they expect to be paid quite a bit oftentimes. As far as the sensitivity, you know, it depends on the specific context. I would think that many of the same items do apply. Certainly if you're worried about getting people to admit to something that's illegal, right? So for example, if they participated in a neo-Nazi rally that in their country is illegal to participate in, you have to worry in the same way about protecting their anonymity. Certainly if you're using more technology, for example, maybe you're using an internet-based survey, they may feel like they are anonymous because there's no interviewer standing in front of them. But if you're surveying online, their IP address could be logged. And in fact, that sort of information gets logged inadvertently by survey firms and researchers all the time. Right, and so there's a whole other way in which privacy can be breached when you're talking about a more developed setting, for sure.
Great, thank you, George. I see your question in the question function now, in addition to asking it live. Our next question comes from Marine Sissing. And Marine, I'm so sorry if I've mispronounced your name. But Marine has asked about your experience in doing this research in areas with a lack of education. And how do you make sure that the lack of understanding of your actual purpose, and perhaps the lack of trust that comes with that, influences the answers?
That's such a tough problem to deal with. It's certainly something that I see in the Philippines frequently, surveying people who have never heard of a survey before, and they don't understand why someone is asking them these questions. They don't really understand references to whichever agency the survey is for. But you know, people are people, and once they get over that initial discomfort or curiosity, or I should say, once they get over the initial discomfort, it often does turn into curiosity. And so one of the things that I've found is helpful is using enumerators who have a lot of experience explaining the survey in very simple terms, explaining it without making any assumptions about experiences or prior knowledge with surveys. And in particular, using enumerators who come from that community So they can introduce themselves as I'm so-and-so, I live in the next village over, or my cousin is this person who you may know. And it builds a level of trust by having this common network with the individual who's asking the questions, even if there's no trust or basis for experience with the survey more generally.
Great, thank you very much. As always, our audience are keen on asking the tough questions. As you only have 10 minutes left, I want to make another call for questions. We would love to hear more people online, but we appreciate that some people don't have sort of the capacity to ask their question live. The next question does come from Lloyd Cassie, and Lloyd has asked, do you have any experience in administering surveys in a self-administered format, especially in gathering reliable and verifiable information? And please let me know if you need me to repeat that, Matthew.
Nope, that's great. One of the toughest issues with self-administering surveys is people get bored and people get lazy and they start to rush through the survey when there's not someone standing in front of them holding them accountable for listening to the question carefully or thinking about their answer before responding. It's human nature. You start rushing through things. There are, you can't solve this problem completely, but there are a few things that you can do to help. The first and foremost is to keep the survey short. So conventional wisdom is that people's attention spans start to drop off pretty steeply after about 20 minutes. And so you should think very, very carefully as you continue adding questions past the 20-minute mark of whether they're actually important and how much information they're going to gain, because there is a serious trade-off once you get past that point. Whereas for non-self-administered surveys, you can usually get away with a bit longer. I think 40 minutes is still pretty comfortable. I would start to think critically after an hour, maybe, but definitely for self-enumeration, keep it as short as possible. You also want to think about the input method for how they are answering the questions and what opportunities it provides for them to make a mistake or to create difficulties for them. So for example, if you're answering on a tablet computer, or if they are answering on a tablet computer, you want to think about the size of the screen and the size of either the keyboard that they're typing on, or any boxes that they're pressing, or sliders that they're sliding. Are they going to have trouble manipulating those with their fingers in often an uncomfortable setting? Maybe they're standing in a crowded place, getting bumped. Is it going to be a problem where they're accidentally putting in the wrong answer, or they're having trouble inputting information? Those are the two things that immediately come to mind.
Great. Thank you, Lloyd, and thank you, Matthew. Our next question comes from Daniela Dijigan again, and it's worth noting that Daniela is a DME for Peace intern at Search for Common Ground, and so for asking 2 questions today, I believe she wins the Intern of the Day award. And Daniela asks, just out of curiosity, have you ever been part of a research survey that was discontinued due to severe non-response?
It has not happened to me personally, thankfully, because I think that's I wouldn't say it's the worst thing that could happen on a survey, but it's not a good thing. But it does happen quite frequently. My advice would be, if you are having a lot of refusal to participate, refusal to answer, you don't have to cancel the survey, but hit pause and go back to some of those people who refuse to answer and make sure you're understanding why they're refusing to answer. There might be a particular question that's tripping them up. And if there is, you could change the way you're asking the question, you could delete it, or at the very least, you can move it to the end of the survey so you can collect all the other information before getting to this one that seems to be causing people to quit. It might simply be a logistical issue. You're knocking on doors at the wrong time of day and people are genuinely busy. And so it's not that they don't want to take the survey, they just don't want to take it right then. Or it might be something about your survey team. They're not properly trained. They're not introducing themselves in the right way. And I certainly understand from a respondent's perspective. I know personally when someone knocks on my door wanting to ask me questions, I often don't answer the door. So I'm sympathetic to that perspective as well. But definitely my advice is don't just give up and cancel the survey, but try to go back to some of those respondents and find out why they're refusing to participate and see if you can do something about it.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Daniela. The next question, and we'll use this as our sort of stopping point for today, comes from Rugomir Makuza Emmanuel, who is from Rwanda, but is currently working on Boko Haram in Chad. And Emmanuel says, thank you for this wonderful presentation. We find it difficult to undertake surveys with populations affected by the Boko Haram conflict because they're often reluctant to divulge information. Have you any ideas on how to tackle this issue?
That is one of the toughest contexts that I can think of for running a survey. So I do not envy that task that you have in front of you, but it is an important one. People get very uncomfortable talking about traumatic experiences that they've suffered. And so one of the strengths of a survey is that it's standardized and systematic. And so it provides for information that can be easily analyzed in a standardized way. But the downside of that standardization is it can often come across as very impersonal and frustrating from a respondent's perspective, either because they feel that the way the questions are written don't account for the nuance and the complicated nature of their experiences, or because the questions and the answer choices are, in their perspective, too rigid, and they have information that they want to provide, and they're not able to provide it. And that can be frustrating from their perspective as well. And so what all of that means in a context where people have had these complicated experiences and these potentially traumatic experiences is you may find that open-ended questions on a survey, or even using qualitative interviews rather than surveys, get a better response. And it's important to try surveys because they have these strengths that can't be easily replaced by other methods, but there are contexts where surveys may turn out not to be effective. And that's one where sort of the nuance of the experiences that people have to share may not be best measured by a rigid, systematic survey.
Great, thank you, Matthew, and thank you for Emmanuel for your question. I think we're at time for today. I just want to thank Matthew again for a great presentation and for your work on this practitioner guide. I know a lot of people have been sort of engaging with the platform and engaging with the project, and we're excited to see sort of how people are able to utilize this in their everyday work. And thank you to the DME for Peace community for joining this edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. This webinar was recorded and will be posted on our media gallery in the coming hours. So please feel free to continue the discussion in the comments and share the recording with your colleagues. As a reminder, this DME for Peace Thursday Talk webinar was hosted from London. We are in town for the Merle Tech conference next week. So if you're interested in chatting all things DME for Peace, chatting about knowledge sharing and monitoring and evaluation in the field, please feel free to get in touch. I'd love to catch up. We're going to be back next week. That's March 22nd with Kate Britton of Amida to lead a discussion on turning data into knowledge within DABA, which is a new data visualization platform that they've just launched. We really just want to advocate sort of the new tools that are out there and sort of showcase those to the wider community. We hope you're able to join that discussion, and you'll have more information about that in your inbox in the next 24 hours. Thank you again, Matthew. Thank you to the DME for Peace community, and I look forward to seeing you online in the not too distant future.